We're joined today on the Daily Signal podcast by Congressman Mark Green of Tennessee, who actually just came back from a trip to the border where you spent several days in El Paso. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, Rachel, thanks for having me on the show.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you with us. So you just got back from El Paso, and you saw up close and personal the situation that we're in right now at our southern border. What are your major takeaways from this trip?
I think first and foremost, the people of ICE and CBP are doing phenomenal work, and they've done phenomenal work in the midst of a massive crisis that overwhelmed the border with limited resources. Now, with the $4.6 billion, they have resources to add, facilities and resources, food, water, all that stuff, trash, all the things that you have to do when you run an operation like they do. But just first and foremost, their hard work and dedication to America. I think number two would be the absolute absurdity that our asylum laws have become and the perverse incentives that it's causing. And I'll give you an example. I think it was Monday night, I did a ride-along with CBP. I'm out on the border riding around with agents, and they apprehended 3 people in a family, a husband, wife, and a child, that were from Brazil. Now, Brazil is not any country that's, nobody is suspecting Brazil of, political, creating political refugees, et cetera. But they flew to Panama, and then from Panama flew to Cancun, and then from Cancun, a combination of bus and walked to our border, walked across, and they came up to the Border Patrol agents. It's not as if they're trying to run away. They go and turn themselves in because they know that if they do so with a child, and if after processing that child is determined to be theirs, they're just released into the country with a court date, 2 to 3 years from now, that they don't necessarily have to show up. And it's really crazy. I mean, with the asylum laws the way they are, we don't have an immigration system in this country. I mean, people with a child come across the southern border, no matter who they are, where they're from, and they're just turned loose in the country. It's crazy.
It's unreal. I was at the border in April, and they told us the same thing. Border Patrol said, we will pick up a family. If there are kids, we'll process them, give them a court date. And a lot of times they said these people never show up for that court date.
40% of the time they never show. And, the remainder of the time they get a court order that tells them to leave, and the vast majority of those don't leave with a court order. That's why, these ICE raids that were vilified by the left and were effectively executed by the Obama administration, I might add. The president is right. President Trump is right. We need to, go and find those individuals that have a court order saying they need to leave America. But I guess the third thing that really impressed me was the absolute contrast. In fact, it's offensive what the Democrats have said about the border, claiming that people are drinking out of toilets. I spoke to the CBP agent who was standing there when the woman described that she was getting water, and she said the Spanish word, the Guatemalan Spanish word for bathroom. And I don't know about you, but I go to the bathroom and get a cup of water out of my sink and drink it. That's essentially what the woman was saying. Of course, Ocasio-Cortez thought she heard she was drinking out of the toilet. The press immediately, blew that out of proportion. I mean, the people that are down there are in it's great conditions, significantly better than where many of them have come from. Air conditioning, they are separated, by ages and by gender and things like that. But there are no cages. There's plenty of food. In fact, at the ICE facility I toured, the dietitian who is providing the menu and the the nutrition of it all is the same individual who does it for Fort Bliss, Texas, our soldiers. And the menus are identical.
Wow.
So they're getting fed the exact same thing that our soldiers are being fed. So this notion, this hyperbole, these incredibly false accusations from the left are offensive. I mean, it just pales. I can't understand that they think that they can just walk all over the truth like this. I'm infuriated at that. So those are probably the three biggies that I walked away from my trip with.
That's incredible. You mentioned, and I saw the photo that you posted on Twitter with the whole situation surrounding when Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said that she had been down at the border and migrants were drinking water out of toilets. And you said you mentioned this, just now as well, that you were there and that's not the case. Are there any other misconceptions that were kind of brought to light when you were down there and actually saw what was happening versus what is being told on the media?
Yeah, the nutrition piece, that's been something that both Ocasio-Cortez and others have talked about. There are snacks that you and I maybe would call sugary snacks, but they're there for the children to eat, Doritos, potato chips, and things like that. Anyone who wants something can go up and get a snack 24/7. But they have hot meals that are very nutritious. As I mentioned earlier, using the dietitian from the military base. So if you look at the snacks and were to think, oh gosh, let's tell everybody this is all the food they're getting and they're eating junk food. Well, yeah, that might be a perception you could have by looking at the stack of juices and things like that. But the truth of the matter is they're getting hot meals that are very nutritious, and then the snacks are just there to be available. Another thing, too, they track everything. They track when the individuals eat. They even track when they shower. So they go to them and they say, it's been, 24 hours since you showered. You're on schedule to shower now. Obviously they've got limited shower stalls, so they have to phase people through. So they go and say, hey, it's your turn. Your code popped up on the system and it's your turn for a shower. And oftentimes people will say, no, I'm not interested. You can't force them. But they're even tracking when these people when it's their turn for the next shower and going to them and telling them. And these guys are doing an amazing job down there. And the mischaracterizations, the falsehoods, the lies are absurd.
Wow, that is really interesting. That's something I myself have never heard. I also wanted to ask you toured an ICE facility and a Customs and Border Patrol station. What were those experiences like? You mentioned there not being cages. That was something that you did not encounter. What was that experience like? What did you see when you were there?
Well, interestingly, at one of the infirmaries we went through, there was an Iraqi who had, flown to Central America and walked up and come across the southern border. So people are coming from all over the world. But if you're asking for sort of the emotional sense, I think the biggest emotion I had was just frustration at the lies of the media and the far left. Clearly, the people are well taken care of. I think the other thing is, I'm proud of my country. One, for how they're taking care of these individuals at the border. I'm also proud that people would want to come to America. Obviously, we've done some things right, and we've got a great country, and people want to come here. I understand. We just have to have a system of laws that work. I prefer merit-based immigration and things like that. But I there was a great sense about how awesome our country is by the resources we're providing. The actual cost that was quoted to me was $250 million just in healthcare alone. For all of CBP delivered to individuals who come across the border. So, that's a lot of American taxpayer dollars going to take care of people who are, trying to come into our country, and we're doing it right. So proud of my country, proud of CBP and ICE, frustrated at the lies of the left. I guess that's my emotional response.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting response. And I feel like when we don't hear all the time, because we hear people on the left and lawmakers in Congress saying, oh, these people are crossing over and then they're being subjected to concentration camp-like conditions. When in fact, there was a report out today in the Washington Examiner that said I think 1.1 million people will have crossed into the border by September 30th. And these people want to come because there's something here and they want to be part of that. So I think that's such a unique and important perspective to remember. We just want to make sure people are doing it legally. Not only did you tour government facilities like ICE and CBP, you also had some meetings with local businesses and ranchers in the area. What are you hearing from Americans who essentially live on the border and experience this crisis day in and day out?
Well, they're incredibly frustrated, and I missed the meeting with the ranchers when they sat down with the ranchers. That was on the end of day 2. But I talked to people in El Paso and business leaders there as I interacted with folks, and they're frustrated. They are overwhelmed. Many obviously there's crime related to this, so they're fearful in that regard. I missed the actual meeting with the ranchers, which was scheduled for the late Tuesday afternoon.
And some of your Democrat colleagues, I heard they traveled to the border last month. Do you think your experience was similar to theirs, or do you know of areas where both of your trips differed or there were different takeaways from those 2 different tracks of visits to the border?
Well, clearly they have different takeaways than us. I mean, they come away saying, just the opposite of what we're saying, which blows my mind. But I will say this. Many of the CBP guys shared with us that the volume was down. And when I did my ride-alongs on the border, I could see the Mexican National Guardsmen actually standing watch across the border. President Trump's trade threats clearly had an impact. Mexico responded, and the number of people coming across the border has significantly decreased. That's something that's relatively new in the past several weeks. Now, Mexico put those guys on a 45-day deployment, so the Border Patrol is aware of this. They anticipate, or the way they described it is they think that they're in the eye of the storm, and that once those 45-day National Guard call-ups are over in Mexico, they anticipate that the volume will increase again. Let's hope Mexico continues to do its part at its southern border. Of course, now there's the agreement with Guatemala too, which will help. But that's probably the biggest difference in the past several weeks.
You mentioned the asylum laws earlier at the start of our conversation. What do you think are some of the biggest loopholes in our current immigration system that need to be fixed? Whether it's asylum laws or other, now that you've been there, what are some things that you're seeing, okay, we need to definitely change how this works?
Well, the court cases and all that stuff that led, we talk about, everybody calls it the Flores Amendment or the Flores Agreement. But the result of all of it is that a child, if there's a child, and if it goes through the process of being verified that it is with the right people, and by the way, one of the things we learned on this trip is that 30% of the people that come over with children, they're fraudulent, meaning they either rented the child. We actually heard that there were people renting their child to come across and be used basically as a visa. That's what this whole Flores thing does, is it allows, if there's a child and it's connected with that individual and it's not fraudulent, then they get released immediately into the country. They get a court date in the future, and that's it. So it's a visa into the United States. The child becomes the visa, and that's got to be fixed. That is the central thing that has to be fixed. Also, the ability to determine credible fear at the border. If we can immediately determine credible fear, then there are people that we could return that wouldn't have to wait on a court date. So those are 2 of the biggest things that need to be fixed.
What would you say during the course of your trip, maybe one of the biggest things that might have reinforced your position about the crisis there or changed it, maybe something that was surprising or something that just reinforced what you've seen, what you've been told by others who actually live there about the crisis that we're seeing?
I was a little surprised to hear the number 30% on, fraudulent families, so to speak. I thought that was much larger than I would have expected. Other surprises, I was surprised to hear how supportive the people on the border are of the president's initiatives. They are very supportive of the tariff threats and the impact that's had. And those are probably the two biggest surprises for me.
What is your take, given there's been a lot, it's no secret, President Trump campaigned on building a wall along the southern border, and there's been opposition to that in Congress and elsewhere. Do you think a wall will help, and why do you think there has been such opposition to it?
Yeah, I think the wall absolutely helps. It is hard to get over, so people go around it. And what that does is it allows the CBP to basically concentrate their efforts. It channelizes the flow of immigrants, migrants, and so they can concentrate efforts and look for, the really bad characters like MS-13, terrorists, and the cartels, the crime that's happening. So you see this stuff, if you can kind of narrow the distances over which you have to look, you can find that needle in the haystack and hopefully either stop drugs, stop MS-13 gangs, and other crime that's happening. Now, obviously, once the immigration laws are fixed, then there'll be more that they can do with regards to immigrants. But right now, it's those drugs and the criminal element that are really the priority to stop.
Well, during your trip, I know that you mentioned you also visited some ports of entry. What was that experience like? What did you see? And what are some reforms in those spaces that you believe need to be made after being there?
I think the entry control points are very good. They're well managed. There is this constant sea of people coming, though, and I don't see an end to that anytime soon until we change the laws. But they do a very good job of inspecting. I think they need more modern technology in terms of X-ray technology. Right now, they're not looking into every single vehicle, every single transport vehicle that comes over. Clearly, that's an opportunity for bad things to happen. It would be great if they had more resources in that area. The other thing I think they could change is, they're not inspecting any of the vehicles going back. And, I think that is clearly an opportunity to identify some of the criminal elements that are coming in and then going back. So I would like to see them inspect more of the traffic that's flowing south.
Given your time visiting and speaking with ICE and CBP officials, what would you say is the mood of those who work so hard to protect the border? Are they overwhelmed? Are they frustrated? Do they feel like they're being listened to? What was the mood that you experienced in getting to spend time with them?
Well, they're great Americans. They love the country, and they're there, for the rule of law. They are encouraged right now because of the support that the president's given, and because the $4.6 billion got approved. I think if I had visited prior to that, there would have been a lot of frustration. But the morale seems to be significantly higher after those two things: the decreased flow from the tariff threats and the $4.6 billion in resources that were approved by Congress. They were in good spirits. They were encouraged, and clearly they love the country.
Well, so you come from Tennessee's 7th Congressional District, and while you don't represent a border state, are there ways that you've seen your state has even been impacted by illegal immigration, even though you're not right at the border?
Well, sure. We see a lot of job displacement. We see a lot of wages are decreased, and undercut because of the employment of illegals. Tennessee has some pretty strong laws. If you have more than 25 employees, you have to e-verify, which I think is a good thing. And then we also have sanctuary city laws. In fact, I myself wrote one and got it passed that if a city becomes a sanctuary city, that city will lose its state economic development funds. That was my sort of anti-sanctuary city bill, and it is now law in Tennessee. So while we have some pretty strong laws in place, there's still individuals that are hiring people that they are, it's illegal to hire, and I think that is undercutting wages and displacing Americans from jobs.
Well, final question. If you could leave your Democrat colleagues and even Americans around the country with one reflection or remark about what you saw this past week about the crisis at the border, what would that be?
And we're a great country, and we are doing great things to take care of these individuals who are flocking to our country. And the CBP and the ICE people are people of heart, and they care, and they're doing everything within their power to manage the crisis. We just need to make sure that Congress fixes the laws and gives those men and women the resources they need to do their jobs.
Well, Congressman Green, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you on the Daily Signal podcast.
Thanks.